All right, we're recording. Fantastic. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. We're now ready to begin our webinar. Corey Rosen, the founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership, he's going to be discussing his latest book, which is Ownership, Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What. So I'm Bethany Dennis. I'm with the Rutgers, New Jersey, New York Center for Employee Ownership. I'm going to be your host and moderator. So the webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes, and you can ask questions in the chat throughout. I would like to remind participants to stay muted and let you know that we are recording. And next slide, Corey, if you can switch. And I want to let you know that we are going to be doing a drawing today after the webinar, and 5 lucky participants are going to receive a free copy of Corey's book. So that's exciting. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Therese. He's the Associate Director for the Center for Employee Ownership, and he's going to introduce Corey. So Jim, take it away.
Thanks very much, Bethany. Bethany, Bill Castellano, and I are very pleased to welcome back Corey Rosen, co-founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO.org. Corey is definitely one of the prime movers in the employee ownership field. He co-founded NCEO in 1981 after working 5 years as a professional staffer in the U.S. Senate, where he helped draft legislation on employee ownership plans. Corey has written more than 100 articles and numerous books, and as Bethany mentioned, he's here to discuss his most recent book, Ownership, Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What. Corey, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks to all of you for attending. So again, there's the name of the book. The book's available on Amazon and other online booksellers, but you can buy it cheaper from us at the National Center for Employee Ownership. It's $3 cheaper to buy it from us normally than most places. So if you want to do that, you have a choice of places. It is on Kindle, and it's also on audiobook just through Amazon. What I'm going to do is talk about what we argue in the book. I'm also going to talk about more nuts and bolts things about what employee ownership is and how it works. So we're going to try to cover both of those, and I really do encourage you to ask questions. I will check in the chat periodically to see what your questions are. And we're having a problem here. Okay, hold on, let's get back to where we should be. All right. So part of the basic argument of the book is it's not fair. You know, if you have little kids, or you're around little kids, what do you hear most often when they get upset? They say, it's not fair. Fairness is a core human value. And right now, people on the left and people on the right and people in the middle are saying our current economic system just isn't fair. The left says, well, let's solve this problem by taxation, redistribution, and regulation. And the right says, get big government and big business out of our lives. Well, really creating change has proven to be elusive. And of course, in our current political environment, the other side is not just wrong about how to do that, they are downright evil. So we don't get anywhere with solving this really almost existential problem of people losing faith in the system, believing that the system is rigged, as you often hear, in favor of a small number of very wealthy people and other elites. And what's most unfair of all about this is ownership. And unfortunately, this is something that isn't really talked about very much. You know, generally when people talk about economic fairness, they talk about income inequality. Well, that's surely very important. But rarely do they talk about wealth inequality, and more importantly, because I think it's a better and more accurate term, as we argue in the book, wealth insecurity. So what do we mean by that? Well, 88% of the financial accounts that hold stocks are owned by the top 1% and just 10% by everyone else. And the top 1% owns 38% of financial assets, while half the American population owns no stock at all. And you can see in this chart how over the last decades, we have seen this growing gap between the productivity of workers and who captures the benefit of that. So if we're just looking here at income, which is the way people generally do, you can say, well, historically, for instance, from 1949 to 69, as productivity went up, so did wages. But that got broken around 1970, and you can see in the gap that comes here that the people who are producing all this wealth were no longer capturing it as much. So the typical worker's wages after inflation from 79 to 2019 grew about 0.27% a year, but real returns on stock ownership grew 8.4% a year. That's 30 times as much. So what's the lesson here? It's that we need to look at wealth and not just income. 20% of Americans have no wealth at all. 40% of Americans cannot cover a financial emergency with available cash. Only half the working age population that works for a private sector employer participates in any retirement plan at all. As our research director, Nancy Wiefek, is fond of saying, the median retirement account balance for a private sector employee is 0, because half the private sector workforce has no retirement assets at all. The net worth of a typical white family, about 10 times that of a Black family. 60% of white families have retirement accounts, 30% of Black families do. And the median ownership of white families compared to Black families is 8 times as much. Now, no matter what you think about the wokeness of all that, about the implications of what we should do about it, this is clearly a problem, because what it means, number one, is that for most Americans, they don't have enough money to retire on. Most Americans are going to have to struggle if they get any kind of financial disruption like healthcare costs. And that pervasive insecurity is bad for people's health, it's bad for the economy, and it really corrupts their belief that the economy works for them. And because of these tremendous gaps in race and gender and other factors, those sectors of the economy, these things are even more true of. So, talked about that. So let's think about how ownership might solve this problem. Oops, sorry. Ownership comes primarily in 2 forms in the United States: ownership of productive capital, company stock. Stock market investors are one, so ownership of public companies. I should use that term really in quotes. What does it mean to be an owner of a public company? Well, I would argue it is analogous to going to the racetrack and betting on a horse. That is your relationship to the stock that you buy as an individual investor. You're not really an investor looking for some long-term growth in the company that you're going to contribute to by giving the company capital to grow. You're making a bet that the stock will increase in value. Meanwhile, most of the stock is held by institutions, pension funds, mutual funds, and most of their trades are done algorithmically, which means that ownership is literally a fraction of a second for most of those owners. The result of this is that, first of all, public company ownership is really just a bet. It's not an investment. Most capital for public companies comes from debt, not equity. And secondly, it means that these companies need to focus on the very short term, on quarter to quarter profits. In fact, the median tenure of a CEO in a publicly held company is just 5 years. And then there's private equity. Well, that has a little longer time frame, typically 3 to 7 years, and they come in and buy companies, trying to ramp up profits as quickly as possible, often by reducing employment or wages, so that they can then sell the company again in a relatively short time. So neither of these focus on the long term, and neither of these generate wealth for very many people. So what's an alternative? What's capitalism the left and right can love? Well, back in the 1950s, Louis Kelso, who was a lawyer and investment banker in San Francisco, was thinking about this problem, and he essentially envisioned that chart that we saw before about how the relationship between capital investment, which improves productivity, and returns to labor, which is what labor gets for it, would become broken. And that increasingly, more and more of the returns from productivity improvements would go to the people who own capital and less to the people who worked for them. So Kelso said, well, there's an answer then, obviously, is that the people who work for them need to be owners too. But that's a problem, right? Because if you don't have much money, how are you going to become an owner? How are you going to buy stock? Kelso's solution was ownership should be a benefit of working for your company. And by providing tax incentives to companies to share ownership, Kelso believed a lot of companies would do it. And so he created this structure, which we'll talk about later, the employee stock ownership plan, as a mechanism to make that happen. But you don't only have to use ESOPs. You could give people stock options or restricted stock or other forms of equity, so that equity becomes part of the employment relationship. So now employee ownership becomes part of the capitalist system. And as a result, it's endorsed by both Republicans and Democrats. It may be the only thing that all three Jessies, Jackson, Ventura, and Helms agreed on. It may be the only thing that Tommy Tuberville and Elizabeth Warren will co-sponsor a bill on, which they did. So both sides see something in this. As we will see shortly, it also works. It's just practically a good idea. Employee ownership is not, as many people think when they first hear the term, it's not some, bakery owned by a worker cooperative, or some, a bunch of little companies that are ideologically in line with employee ownership. Some of the country's largest companies are majority owned by their employees. Publix and Winco, for instance, two of the largest supermarket chains in the country, are majority employee owned. And it is common for people who work there for, say, 20 years to retire with over $1 million in stock. 7 of the largest 15 engineering companies are 100% employee owned. The 3 largest USAID contractors are employee owned. So you can find employee owned companies among some very large companies, and you can find thousands of them in companies ranging from just a handful of employees to thousands of employees. One of my favorites is Johnny's Pizza House, has about 900 employees, and you literally can own a slice of the pie. So does this work? If we did, in fact, use this system of sharing ownership, and I'll explain how these plans work shortly, but if we did have a policy that encouraged more employee ownership, would this really help solve the problem? Well, fortunately, there are reams of data on this topic, and much of it has come out of the great work done by scholars at Rutgers. We've done a lot of it ourselves. And what we found, amongst other things, is that employee owners have 2.2 times their retirement assets. In fact, in a new study we did that looks comprehensively at basically every ESOP company, we found that's closer to 3 times the retirement assets now. The median household net wealth of an employee owner is 92% higher. Employee owners are 1/3 to 1/4 as likely to be laid off. Another new study we just did found that retention rates are dramatically higher in ESOP companies. The Great Resignation is not affecting them as much as it is with other non-employee ownership companies. That companies can pay for this because they grow faster, and because they're employee-owned, they can focus on the long term. So let's stop here for a minute. Let's say that somebody had this idea. They said, well, I got this idea. This idea will increase the wealth of most Americans. And because of the way these plans are structured, it won't discriminate against lower paid workers. We'll see why that's the case in a bit. So lower paid workers are going to benefit from this more than in other, say, retirement plans like 401k plans. The companies will generate more jobs. The employees will generate more wealth, which they can then use in their community to buy houses, to buy cars, to send their kids to college. So it really works well. And it's politically practical. It's something the left and the right really like. In fact, in all the years there's been legislation on employee ownership, not once has there been a dissenting vote. You might say, well, gee, we should really be standing on rooftops promoting this idea. It's politically practical and it actually works. Imagine that. Not many things do. Granting, and those data all were about ESOPs. Granting equity broadly, it turns out, works also. It doesn't work quite as well as ESOPs. It's not, the effect is not as dramatic, but it definitely is significant. All right, let's start looking at what these plans actually are and how they work. So we've talked about this sort of magical notion that companies will become employee-owned and they'll perform better and their employees will do better. How do we get there? How do you create a company that's employee-owned? And why would any business owner even want to do this? Well, ESOPs were started in 1974. There's about 7,000 companies that have ESOPs or ESOP-like plans, 14 million participants, and $1.4 trillion in assets. The vast majority of these companies, 94%, are closely held companies, although the large majority of participants are in public companies just because they're so large. By far, the biggest use for ESOPs is as succession planning. I'll explain how this works shortly, but ESOPs have been given substantial tax and planning benefits to make them a really terrific succession planning tool for closely held companies. Other companies use them to finance growth, again, relying on some of these tax benefits. And still other companies, particularly public companies, use them primarily as an extra employee reward and a match to 401k deferrals. There are tax benefits for everybody. So let's say that you're an owner of a closely held company and you're facing a time in your life when it's time to start thinking about selling, at least part of your ownership, maybe all of it. Well, the core idea of an ESOP is really pretty simple. The company uses its future profits to buy stock from one or more owners. These profits are tax deductible. The employees do not buy the shares. The company gets tax benefits and the sellers get tax benefits. So let's just review this, because this in many ways is a counterintuitive idea that people have a hard time getting their hands around. I've talked to many, many business owners and explained how an ESOP works. We go through it in some detail. And at the end of that conversation, they say, I understand everything you just told me, Corey. When do the employees buy the stock? And the first thing I had told them is employees don't buy the stock. The company uses its future tax-deductible earnings to buy the shares for them. And maybe you think, well, why would they do that? That's an odd idea. It's not an odd idea at all. If you went and bought a company, if you used your savings or you borrowed money from a bank to go buy a company, you would only buy that company if you believed that the future profits of that company would enable you to repay the acquisition cost that you invested, right? So anybody who goes and buys a company is doing exactly the same thing. They're using the future profits of the company to repay the acquisition cost. The ESOP does the same thing, but it does it with a tax benefit, namely that those future profits are tax deductible when they're used to purchase stock, whereas normally those future profits would not be tax deductible. If you bought the company, they wouldn't be tax deductible. The employees get shares as this acquisition proceeds. Now I'm going to just stop quickly and see if there are questions. Given the administrative costs of ESOPs, is there a better option for small businesses? Well, it depends how small is small. Generally, ESOPs work pretty well for profitable companies of 20 employees or more. If you're smaller than that number, the costs of doing it might not justify the tax benefits might not justify the cost. And so if you're in that situation, and we'll get to a slide on this later, there are a variety of other things that you can do in order to give people ownership. And here, how important is the corporate tax deduction to the company in the transition? In the UK, there's no corporate deduction, but they're still making transactions. And the UK has a system somewhat similar to the US. And they don't get a tax deduction, but the owner gets a tax exclusion by selling to an employee ownership trust. So that's part of why they're growing quickly there. Here, the benefits are a little different, as I'll explain. And we're stuck again. So what could the owner have done instead? Well, the owner could sell to private equity. Some of you may remember Gordon Gekko here from Wall Street, who said, greed is good. You could sell to private equity. And as I said, private equity will probably flip your company in several years. They really don't care very much about your company as a company. It's just an asset. And you spent your whole life building a company. Is that really what you want to do? Well, sometimes, because maybe Gordon's going to give you a really good price. But a lot of business owners feel really bad about selling to Gordon. You could sell to some big company consolidator firm. They might treat you better, but very often they're going to reduce at least some portion of your workforce because of at least administrative overlap with what they already do. And they will promise you that they will retain your culture and your legacy and your values, but they generally won't. So again, a lot of business owners say, well, they're giving me a really good price, sounds good. But a lot of small business owners just aren't comfortable. Or you could sell to everybody, as this is an employee-owned company. They got everybody out in the field and they're all owners. This is a nice quote from Kelly Pryor. You can read this. That really captures what I just said. And it's really worked. Everyone there is at the start of ESOP in 2006 now has more than $100,000 in account value. for which they contributed 0. So nuts and bolts. Well, the company sets up a trust, much like a trust for other retirement plans like 401k. To fund this trust, which purchases the shares from the owner, to fund this trust, the company contributes cash and takes a tax deduction. That means normally the repurchase of shares by a company is not tax deductible. So if you say want to buy $1 million in stock, you might have to earn $1.4 million pre-tax. With an ESOP, it is deductible, so $1 million gets you $1 million. You could also say, well, I'd like to sell a lot of stock at once. And so now the trust takes out a loan to buy a larger block of shares. That loan can come from a bank, it can come from the seller in the form of a seller note, or a combination. And this could even buy 100% of the company this way. The company then contributes, again on a tax-deductible basis, dollars to the trust, which it uses to repay the loan. Employees don't buy the shares, and the shares are bought at an appraised value from an outside appraisal. Now, the employees in this trust, everybody who's worked there for 1,000 hours, some companies are more generous than that, maybe include everybody, but at least all employees who worked for 1,000 hours in a year are in the plan. As the stock goes into the plan, that stock is allocated to all the participants based on their relative pay or a more level formula. And there's a cap on how much pay you can count. So really highly paid people get less. The shares vest over up to 6 years. When the employee leaves, the shares are repurchased by the company. Big inducements to do this. Again, it's pre-tax money. The sellers can defer tax on the gain by reinvesting in stocks and bonds of U.S. operating companies. There is no other way to do that other than sell to an ESOP. And in S corporations, profits attributable to the ESOP aren't taxable. So 100% ESOPs pay no tax at all. So that's basically the mechanism for ESOPs. They are, as someone indicated, costly and complicated administratively. So depending on the transaction and the size of the company, it could be from $100,000 to several $100,000 to do it. People really blanch at that. But if you are comparing the cost of selling your company to an ESOP versus selling to someone else, it's going to be probably cheaper to do it through an ESOP. And if you're interested, I can explain why. But selling a company is just complicated. And selling a company to other buyers typically carries contingencies. Like, we'll pay you this much money if the company makes X amount of dollars. ESOPs have no contingencies. But you can imagine you're a pretty small company, maybe $200,000 is just more than you can manage. So there are other approaches that you can use. So what are these? Well, you can grant equity rights to most or all employees. We see this a lot in the tech sector. Starbucks does it too, though, so it's not just the tech sector. And these are things like stock options or restricted stock grants. So stock options give you the right to purchase shares at a price fixed today for some number of years into the future. If they go up, then you buy the shares. And if they don't go up, you don't buy them. Restricted stock says, we're going to give you some stock, but you have to do something in order to really get it. And typically you have to work for a few years. Worker cooperatives, which is what a lot of people think about ESOPs. Worker cooperatives are great. They're funded by the employees, not by the company. They typically are in very small companies, although there are a few large ones. Curiously, and because this is a Rutgers meeting, I can't resist saying this, there are many more studies of worker cooperatives than there are worker cooperatives. There's a tremendous amount of interest amongst academics in worker cooperatives, but there are only about 800 worker cooperatives employing maybe 10,000 people, which would fit comfortably into a number of very large ESOP-owned companies, just any one of them. But worker cooperatives are a really good tool for the right circumstance. Platform cooperatives are a really intriguing idea where, imagine, for instance, Uber or Lyft, the software was owned by the drivers instead of somebody else. There's really no reason why that couldn't be the case other than getting the financing to get that off the ground. But I think platform cooperatives, there are not very many of them, but there's growing interest in it. I think are a tremendously promising idea. And finally, employee ownership trust. This is what they do in the UK, and there's probably 30 or 40 of them here. They don't have any rules. You make up whatever rules you want. The main difference for employee ownership trust is that the trusts are meant to be permanent, so the company's never sold, and the employees don't have individual capital accounts. So they don't actually own any equity in the company unless the company is sold. And let me stop there and get some of the questions. An example of platform is a cooperative, Stocksy, which is photographers own the software that you pay that software company to buy their photographs to use them on your website. There's also a couple of cab cooperatives now that are doing the same thing. What do I think of the co-op models in Mondragon? I've been to Mondragon. It's sort of a, everybody's pilgrimage that you have to make if you're involved in employee ownership. It's about an 80,000 employee company of multiple cooperatives. It's fabulous in many ways. And in some ways it's too fabulous because people have endlessly tried to replicate it. And so far, nobody really has. I think it's absolutely wonderful. I think it's just proven really hard as a model. One of the things that's really great about ESOPs is they are scalable. I mean, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of money. And they may not be perfect from people's standpoints, but they're sure a lot better than the alternative. I work with business owners who are interested in establishing ESOPs. I hear from consultants that the estimated transaction costs are $150,000 to $200,000. Are there tricks to get around this? No, there aren't. There are ways that you can do the transaction more cheaply. The big difference is when you're using advisors who charge a success fee. And these advisors are saying to you, we will sell your company and we will look at multiple potential buyers. And we will charge you a percentage of the transaction. And if you didn't do an ESOP, that's what you would do. And that's why it's more expensive to sell to another company rather than sell to an ESOP, because you always have that success fee plus the contingencies. In an ESOP, if you're sure you don't want to sell to somebody else, don't pay the success fee. Get lawyers and other advisors who will just charge you based on how much they work. But you're not going to get much lower than the $100,000 to $200,000 for a transaction. Again, if what you're looking at is comparing this to selling to someone else, this is cheaper than selling to someone else. Let's say you've got a $3 million company. You will pay between 2.5% and 5% of the transaction to the M&A firm or broker who arranged the deal for you, plus lawyers and appraisers and accountants. So you're looking at a total cost in that of $300,000 to $400,000, plus contingencies that you may not get as much as you think you plan to get if things don't go well. If what you're doing is saying, I just want to share ownership with employees, I'm not interested in selling right now, I'm a small company, the tax benefits don't justify that cost, then you want to look at some of those other options, like stock options, restricted stock. I didn't talk about phantom stock and stock appreciation rights, where people don't actually get any shares, but they get the value of the shares. A lot of smaller companies do that. Are there any advancements in technology? We are working on a feasibility assessment tool, and I'm hoping we'll launch that maybe the end of the year. It's a really complicated thing. Pros and cons of roll-up ESOPs. So what a roll-up ESOP is when a company goes and it buys one company after another. There's not a lot of these, but what we are seeing, and the terminology maybe here is, what's technically a roll-up versus just an acquisition. We are seeing a tremendous amount of ESOP companies buying other companies. There are more ESOPs being created out of an ESOP company buying another company, and that company then becoming part of the parent ESOP, than there are new ESOPs being created each year. It's probably about 500 a year. There's one company, Integrity Marketing, that's done about 150 acquisitions in the last 3 years, growing from 1,000 to 6,000 employees. So there's some very aggressive acquirers there. Is that a roll-up? I mean, it depends on what happens to the company in terms of the internal management structure. There's also ESOP holding companies, where the company at the holding company level has a bunch of different companies in different businesses that it buys for diversification, and the employees own stock in the holding company. And then there's a really interesting example, and I think this is exactly a roll-up, of Galaxy Vets, which, and I don't know what you know about the vet industry, but it's been extraordinarily stressful and difficult for vets. They're trying to create a much more humane model, and they are buying veterinary practices, including all the employees in ownership, and then they become part of this Galaxy parent company, but the individual vet practices operate still fairly independently. You should, if you're interested, go to their website. It's a fascinating model and a fascinating guy who's doing it, a really terrific guy. What's the biggest missing piece that's limiting the number of businesses that explore the path to employee ownership? And that happens to be the next slide. I'll hold off on that. What's the failure rate of ESOPs? Important question. We did a study during the recession period of 2009 to 2013. We found that the default rate on ESOP loans was 2 per thousand per year, 2 per thousand per year. So ESOP companies do go bankrupt, they do fail, but much, much less than other companies. Do you see ESOPs coming in the interior of the country? Well, there aren't very many EOTs, I should say, in the US right now. There's probably 30 or 40. So regional differences, that's just random noise. What's the advantage to the employees of companies being acquired by an ESOP holding company versus a roll-up structure or a sale to a third-party private equity firm? Well, unless you sell to KKR or a company like that, that's giving everybody equity as part of the deal, selling to a private equity firm is not good news generally for employees. I've yet to meet an employee who's thrilled about that idea. In terms of being acquired by an ESOP holding company versus a roll-up structure, I don't, the employees are, it's pretty much the same thing, really. The difference would be the extent to which the management of the acquired company gets subsumed into the management of the parent, rather than the holding company keeping these companies as fairly independent operating units. I'm working on a project, in fact, right now on creating a toolkit for selling to an ESOP company, because I think this is going to be a pretty big thing. So there's a question about, it is such a good idea, people ask me this all the time, such a good idea, Corey, why doesn't everybody do it? And there are a lot of good ideas that everybody doesn't do. I mean, think about it. With diet, exercise, and all kinds of things that's a good idea, but people don't do that. Here, there's some pretty specific things. The biggest barrier is that people don't know what this is. They've never heard of an ESOP. If you say employee ownership, I can guarantee you that most business owners' first reaction will be, my employees don't have the money to buy the company. If they've heard of it, maybe they heard of, I don't know, United Airlines or Tribune Company, or one of the more notable failures. So lack of knowledge is a big barrier. And sometimes, while they have some knowledge, what they know is wrong. So that's a big barrier. Advisors generally prefer their clients to do something different. So you go to your accountant or your financial planner or your lawyer, or even worse, a business broker, and you say, I'm interested in this ESOP idea. Well, if the advisor is not really familiar with it, what do people do with ideas they're not familiar with? They tend to think that must not be a very good idea. If I don't understand it, it's probably not a very good idea. That's just human nature. They also may be afraid, well, if you do an ESOP, but I don't know how to do it, you'll get somebody else who does know how to do it. And worse, if you're a broker or an M&A firm, you're going to make a lot more money selling that company to somebody else than you are to selling to an ESOP. And I've talked to people in those circumstances and explained all the benefits and had them say, it's a really good idea, but not for me. So I'm not going to recommend it. My favorite example is a company called Geneva Capital, which was an M&A firm that did this over and over and over again, telling clients, don't do this, until the owner was ready to retire and did an ESOP for Geneva Capital. And then they became a big promoter. Financing for some deals can be difficult. If you want to become 100% employee owned, you're not going to get a bank loan to do it all at once. So a seller note's going to be part or all of that transaction. That's fine for a lot of sellers, but other sellers want to get paid sooner. So they say, well, I just need to sell to somebody else, sorry. And why we wrote the book is, do you know any thought leaders and political leaders who actually talk about this? Have you ever seen, other than Bernie Sanders, really briefly, presidential candidates talking about this? Have you ever seen a pundit talking about this? Almost never. I talked to a high advisor for the Clinton campaign who was an advocate of employee ownership, and the NCEO had been involved in writing a position paper for the Center for American Progress, which promoted employee ownership, which served as the core of Clinton's political economic platform. And I said, well, why? She never even mentioned it. And he said, it's not controversial enough. I never thought about that. If it's not controversial, somebody running can't distinguish themselves by being in favor of it. So it was just not talked about. So these are all big barriers. So what can we do? Well, some tax rules need tweaking, where a lot of people are working on legislation to try to get some financing guarantees, so the seller note piece could be reduced. You could link deductions for executive compensation to having broad-based ownership. Funding local outreach programs. I'm delighted to say that the state of New Jersey, the budget from the governor, includes $6 million, part of which will be for supporting the costs of doing an ESOP. So that's another thing that could be done at the state level. We think these state level programs to create outreach and some funding for the work to set up an ESOP could be tremendously helpful. And there's a number of states that are either have legislation which is likely to pass right now, or in a few cases already has passed and is part of the law. So if you want to get involved in your state, this would be a great thing to do, and let me know and I can give you material to do that. Right now, government contracting preferences are not available to ESOPs, so that would be helpful. One of the best things you can do is just talk about it. Make it a reality by making it something people actually talk about. If we can get the word out to a point where employee ownership is widely understood as capitalism that works not just for the few, but for the many, I think we're at a stage of existential crisis for democracy and capitalism, where people are going to be grasping at solutions that work politically and work practically, and this is one. Got a couple more questions. And okay, based on your observation, you see any trade-off for ESOP employees in terms of their total compensation? No. In fact, their compensation is somewhat higher in ESOP companies than comparable companies. There is a slight reduction in company contributions to 401k plans, about an average of $400 a year, but the average ESOP contribution from those same companies is $4,000 a year. So you're trading off $400 in diversified assets for $4,000 in company stock, not a bad deal. And the business broker fee issue, ideas on how to solve that. Boy, I wish I had one. If anybody's got a good idea, that would be great. Our city government accidentally excluded employee-owned companies from subcontractor preferencing. I'm not sure it was accidental. Most of these preference programs are for disadvantaged groups. And legally, the ESOP trust is not a disadvantaged person, even if the company is 100% owned by disadvantaged people, it doesn't qualify. There's efforts to try to look through that or come up with other ways. It's been a difficult challenge. Let me just note here that the promotional plug, the book is Ownership, Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What. And as I said, it's widely available, but it's cheaper on our website, nceo.org. And if you're interested in employee ownership and you want to pursue this idea further, the National Center for Employee Ownership is a really valuable resource. We've got over 38, I think now, separate titles on how to do employee ownership, ESOPs, employee ownership in LLCs, equity compensation plans. Whatever approach you want to take, we've got a book on it, or many books on it in some cases. We have a lot of toolkits for boards, for companies considering plans. We have webinars. We have a really extensive document library that can help you save money. If you had a lawyer or other professional develop these documents, it would cost tens of thousands of dollars. They are free to members on the NCEO website. And you can contact us anytime with questions about anything about employee ownership. So go to nceo.org and check us out. We are a nonprofit. We're entirely supported by membership and publication sales and conferences. If you're really interested, we have our annual conference coming up in Kansas City, April 24th to the 27th. And take a look at that and register for that. Another question, what needs to happen at the company level to the basic readiness of companies and employees? Well, you first need to do a feasibility assessment to see not just how you would do the transition, but whether you should do it at all. So the feasibility study will walk you through the various options and financing mechanisms, and you can make a determination if it makes sense, and if so, how to do it. And on a very preliminary basis, I can help anybody there think through what those steps are. If you decide you're going to do this, there's a whole bunch of things you have to do. You hire a trustee and a lawyer, and you have to have an appraisal done. And at the point where you've decided to do it, that's typically when companies will announce that the company is becoming employee owned. And then you really need to think about culture. Because what makes employee ownership companies perform better is high involvement cultures. And these are work teams, high involvement strategic planning, open book management. If you're interested in that topic, I wrote a book called Beyond Engagement, How to Make Your Business an Idea Factory. And it steps you through a number of examples, very step-by-step examples of how companies create these high involvement cultures. So it's called Beyond Engagement, How to Make Your Business an Idea Factory. You know, people talk a lot about employee engagement as the critical factor. Well, watching the Warriors last night, I was very engaged, but I wasn't involved. And if you're going to have a really successful company, engagement's not enough. You need involvement. And I've run a little bit over. Any last questions? I'm going to put my email in the chat here. And put my phone number. So feel free to reach out to me. Oops, that's not right. Let's try that again, the phone number. It's a different phone number I put here, but that's my work number. Any last questions?
Thank you, Corey. If you could switch over to the 2 slides over towards the end. I just want to do a quick plug for our online program. If you can get there.
2 slides down.
Yeah, it's the online education program. Do you see it? There it is.
There we
Okay,
go.
good. Oh, there it is. So thanks, Corey. It was absolutely wonderful. It was a good refresher for me too. I appreciate it. I just wanted to do, speaking of free, a plug on our online education program. So I guess it's been about a year, but the Kellogg Foundation, think Kellogg cereal, they have a foundation and they tasked Rutgers to develop an online education program geared toward minority-owned businesses to, but it's free and open to anybody. But that was the task and there's 10 modules in each track. There's an ESOP track and a worker cooperative track, and you can register for, you know, one or the other, or you can register for both of them, and it's has a deeper dive into what Corey's been talking about. So there's a link there. It's on our website. You can just email me and I'll give you the link. And it's self-paced, you know, you take, you know, watch the videos. They're about a half hour each, whenever you like. So that's it. I wanted to remind everybody that we are going to, this has been recorded. We're going to send the recording out to everybody. If Corey's okay with it, I can send out the slides to everybody.
Please do.
And we are going to do a drawing. 5 lucky winners are going to get a copy of Corey's book. So I'll let you know about that probably on Monday. So look for that email from me. Thank you for being here. We
Corey,
really
thanks.
appreciate it.
Thank
Corey,
you. And I
thanks so
put
much.
my put
Corey,
our
thanks so
website
much
in
for
the
joining
chat
us. We
area,
really appreciate it.
nceo.org. So
Yep.
I really appreciate the opportunity to do this and the great work that's being done at Rutgers. It's terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.
Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, thank you very much.